Hello and welcome to today's webinar entitled Enhancing Poverty Alleviation Performance, the Importance of Implementing Multidimensional Metrics. My name is Sandra Draheim and I am the Marketing Manager for the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan, who is bringing you this webinar today. The William Davidson Institute, or WDI as we call it, is an independent nonprofit education, research, and applied practice organization. We're dedicated to actionable business and public policy approaches to address challenges and opportunities in emerging market economies. Today's webinar is the first in a series of 3 webinars about assessing poverty alleviation performance, and we hope you will attend the next 2, as well as the hands-on impact assessment workshop in Ann Arbor, Michigan this October. The dates and times of these events are on the first slide, and you can get details and register at the link provided at the bottom of the slide you can currently see. A couple of housekeeping notes about today's presentation. If you have questions during this webinar presentation, please type them into the dialog box on your screen and press send. We will answer as many of your submitted questions as possible at the end of the presentation so that all attendees can hear the answers. Additionally, the webinar is being recorded and I'll provide all attendees with a link to it within a day or 2. I'd like to introduce today's presenters, starting with Heather Esper and Yaquta Fatehi. Heather is WDI's Impact Assessment Program Manager, and Yaquta is Research Associate in the same program. And our guest speaker today is Julie Peachey, Director of Social Performance at the Grameen Foundation. If we go to the next slide, briefly, today's agenda will start with Heather and Yaquta discussing multidimensional outcomes of poverty reduction programs, and then Julie from Grameen will talk about poverty metrics. The last 15 to 20 minutes will be dedicated to answering questions from the audience. So remember to type in your questions and send them using the dialog box on your screen. I'll be turning this over to Yaquta shortly, but I would like to launch a quick poll question for the audience. If the audience could please look at their screen and click on all of the answers that might apply to you regarding this question. Very good. I'm going to close this. And then let's look at the quick results. Lots of measurement challenges you faced. So good, you're in the right place today. At this point, I would like to turn over the presentation to Yaquta Fatehi.
Hi everyone, I'm Yaquta and welcome to our Impact Assessment Series. We're very excited to present the first in our 3-part webinar series and hope you'll also join us for the 2nd and 3rd presentations, which will come up in June and July. So our overall goal is to increase awareness and ability of social enterprises and poverty reduction programs to identify and measure their multidimensional poverty outcomes using both qualitative and quantitative methods. We aim to do this by sharing real-world project examples and experiences from on-the-ground implementers. So let's get started. Beginning at a high level, and in fact, if there is anything we stress that you take away today, it's this particular slide. So what do we mean by multidimensional outcomes? Here we want to focus on the term multidimensional, which refers to 3 things. We firstly mean speaking to all local stakeholders when assessing change by a program or by a social enterprise in the community. Not only those stakeholders that interact, such as the end beneficiaries of a program or BOP customers or distributors of a social enterprise, but also those that do not actually engage with the venture. So examples of these could be farmers that do not sell their produce to the venture. They could be non-customers that do not buy the product or service from the venture. Because I use the term BOP, which stands for base of the pyramid, I want to quickly define it. It's the socio-economic segment of society that earns 3,000 USD or less per year in PPP and mainly engages in the informal economy. Now we'll go into details about stakeholders in the next slide. So the second thing about multidimensional outcomes is not only should you be measuring economic indicators, which is the most popular, but also studying changes in capability and relationship well-being of your local stakeholders. Now Heather will take you through examples of such indicators, but staying at a high level, capability refers to the individual's physical health, mental health, knowledge, skills, and aspirations. Relationship well-being refers to changes in the individual's role in his or her family and in the community. It also refers to the quality of the local physical and cultural environment resulting from the enterprise's activities. Now thirdly, you should also be assessing both positive as well as negative changes on your stakeholders and in the local physical and cultural environment. So some of the examples that we've found in our work at WDI is, for example, is cash cropping increasing the risk of reduced food diversity for the farmer household? Does creating jobs for women in the community alter cultural norms which are disliked by village elders, etc.? So Heather will get into the specific reasons why tracking negative changes is extremely important. What I'm going to do is move into the next slide. So the way these slides are designed is that first we explain our reasoning behind why we believe this is important, followed by quotes from external organizations that also support the same methodology. What we wanted to show here was that it's not just WDI or us talking about these types of multidimensional outcomes, it's also practiced by many organizations in our space. So let's discuss why speaking with all local stakeholders is a must. Firstly, we want to gauge changes on all persons, including those that do not engage with the program or the social enterprise. So like I mentioned on the previous slide, these are persons who live in the community where the social enterprise or the program operates, but they do not interact with one another. So even what we mean over here is even though they're not engaging with one another, they may still be affected by the venture's activities, such as when the business impacts a public good like air or water resources. To sum it up, it's important to speak to or survey BOP customers, distributors, producers, employees, and those in the broader community. It's also possible that the venture may have positive impacts on one group of persons, but negative impacts on another group. So unless you're speaking with all groups, you could be missing, very vital information that are important for your analysis. Secondly, speaking with all stakeholders is actually a great way to triangulate data. Often by speaking with just the employees and management, you learn of impacts they believe occur on their customers. By speaking with the customers directly, even though we recognize this increases both time and financial resources required, you are learning firsthand whether those specific impacts, both in terms of likelihood of them occurring as well as the magnitude of the impact, actually occur or not. Now thirdly, now that you have all the data and findings, you can develop nuanced and specific recommendations for one group of persons when you find that you're not having the necessary impact on them or what you thought you were having. So to summarize, speaking to all local stakeholders also allows you to develop recommendations to improve or enhance impacts or course correct your program. And finally, you increase transparency and accountability with your investors. So here's an excellent quote that captures what we recommend. It's by Nicholas von Prague, who was an advisor on the 2011 World Development Report. What he says is, what is missing from the many evaluation reports in the inboxes of humanitarian agencies and donors are independent and systematic assessments based on feedback from beneficiaries themselves. Capturing their views would complement and give context to conventional data-driven assessments. It would ensure that the people in need of humanitarian assistance and protection are better served, and that the resources intended to help them are better used. What is more, it would increase the credibility and thus attractiveness to potential donors of those humanitarian agencies that can show they're doing what their beneficiaries need them to do. Okay, we're going to move on to the next slide. So here at WDI, we're big proponents of multidimensional indicators of poverty because we strongly believe that poverty is not just an income threshold that one falls under. Poor households and individuals who earn low or irregular incomes also have poor access to quality services such as education and health. Their poor ability to purchase adequate nutrition, housing, sanitation, etc. is also compounded by the fact that they often pay a poverty penalty when the costs and time spent to access products and services are taken into account. So by measuring a variety of indicators across areas of well-being, so them being economic capability and relationship well-being, your program or social enterprise can get a better picture of the changes made by your activities. This then allows you to better manage results. Now we'll go into the details of each area of well-being in the upcoming slides. What we want to share is an excellent quote by Tom Adams at Acumen, who recommends expanding the metrics you collect to beyond output metrics and beyond just financial metrics. So here goes. The whole question hinges on one's definition of impact. If impact equates to scale, say jobs created, then it is little surprise that you'd find financially well-run businesses deliver bigger impact. The assessment is biased by using a narrow output-based metric as your sole barometer for impact, one for which financial discipline will have a high degree of causality. It's an illusionist trick of sorts. Finance equals scale, scale equals impacts, and hey presto, finance equals scale impact. So we'll move on to the next slide. Now we're going to get into the details of the areas of well-being, starting with the economic well-being outcomes. So now the economic dimension captures an individual's financial well-being and control over resources. While we all commonly use income stability, savings, and debt as indicators, we want to highlight indicators such as changes in economic risk, by which we mean the potential for risk in engaging in a business, that is, whether it'll be a success or a failure for that household. Another good example is the cost to engage with the social enterprise or program, because sometimes these might have requirements that cost money to the BOP individual or to his household, his or her household, because the program might have certifications that the household needs to match up with. So here the individual must then comply with these in order to work with the venture, which may hence result in a cost. So what we want to highlight is that in our research in this space, we found that there are various organizations and tools or frameworks that include economic well-being indicators. So what you see on the right of the slide in the blue box are actually examples of frameworks that we found that have economic well-being measures. I won't go into them, but we'll have the slides available for you later on, and you can read through those examples. Right, moving on to the next slide. Here what we did was we wanted to share a quote from an external organization that also stresses the importance of collecting economic indicators. There are two of them listed, but I'm only going to go into the one by David Rudman from the Center for Global Development. Here he highlights the importance of economic well-being for an individual or household from the BOP. So financial services are like clean water and electricity. They're essential to leading a better life. Imagine if you didn't have access to bank accounts, insurance, or mortgages. Poor people need such services more than anyone because in developing countries, poverty does not just mean low income, it also means volatile income. The poor need to set aside money in times of plenty and draw it out in lean times. Now we're going to go quickly into a poll question, and then after that I'm going to hand it over to Heather to take you into the remaining two areas of well-being.
As you can see on the screen, we do have another poll question. If everyone could click all that apply to them and then hit submit. I'll wait a few seconds. Okay, I've closed the poll. And I am sharing the results. Thank you. Go back to the presentation right now.
Great. Thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Yaquta. Now we're moving into the capability well-being outcomes. And I'll be sharing through the end of this presentation and then turning it over to Julie to share more about the Grameen Foundation. It is well recognized by experts that poverty includes a deprivation of capabilities. Amartya Sen, a world-renowned economist, has been credited with pioneering the capability approach, which brings together a range of ideas that were excluded from traditional approaches to the economics of welfare. The core focus of the capability approach is on what individuals are able to do. Given that individuals are deprived in many ways, we categorize the deprivation into two types of well-being: capability and relationship. When an individual is limited by their own means, such as a lack of knowledge or skills, we define it as capability well-being. And when individuals are limited by others, such as their social networks, government, or environment, we define it as relationship well-being. Based on this definition, the capability well-being dimension encompasses an individual's physical health, psychological health, knowledge, and skills, as well as their feelings about themselves and their capabilities, including changes in self-confidence, self-efficacy, self-worth, empowerment, contentment, dignity, and aspirations. And please note, these indicators of each type of well-being are not meant to be inclusive. And as you can see, following the format earlier, there's some examples of different frameworks and organizations that track changes in capability well-being. Now moving on to the next slide. These capability well-being metrics are important to capture because they provide a more holistic understanding of changes that occur due to a social enterprise or program, as well as how they may occur. For instance, a study by the University of Togo in Malawi shows that increases in income from unconditional cash transfer program caused large improvements in adolescent mental health and decreased the risk of sexually transmitted diseases among adolescent girls. The effects on mental health seem to be due in partly to increased consumption, leisure, and family support for education. Using this example, if the study had stopped at measuring changes in economic well-being, such as income, they would have lost the story of other important changes resulting from the increased income, which in this case were changes in two types of capability well-being: psychological health, meaning improvements in adolescent mental health, and physical health, meaning decreased risk of sexually transmitted diseases. Additionally, if the study had only measured changes in economic well-being, they wouldn't have a clear understanding of how these impacts occur, which would limit their ability to further enhance such outcomes. Excuse me. By studying other types of well-being, they learned that changes in mental health result from a mix of inputs from economic well-being, so in this case increased income and consumption, capability well-being, so in this case increased leisure, and relationship well-being, which I'll get to in a moment, which is increased family support. With such information, the program can then increase other inputs, such as the capability and relationship inputs, besides income, and to further improve mental health and its benefits. Moving on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about relationship well-being. An individual's well-being is affected by their relationships with others and the environment. We often forget to account for how engaging with social enterprises or programs affects these relationships. The relationship dimension moves beyond the individual by examining how interactions with others increases or reduces their isolation and the poverty they experience. Such indicators include changes in social support, social networks, relationship with spouse, the relationship with family members, the support they receive from family members, or the types of interactions, and their roles and status. The relationship dimension also includes resources that individuals can draw upon from their roles, status, and networks, as well as their surrounding environment. Such indicators include changes in access to formal institutions, so access to different services in their community, their changes in values and beliefs about society, changes in their local environment, their ecosystem outcomes, and home environment, such as the quality of their housing. Moving on to the next slide, I wanted to share an example of how this can be useful collecting this data. In the Journal of Management Studies, Shazid Ansari et al. Highlight that while increase in income can enhance outcomes, especially at lower income levels, it need not be seen as the ultimate yardstick of development or well-being. And if it leads to social disruption, income growth may reduce rather than enhance well-being. One example of this is found in a March 2014 National Bureau of Economic Research working paper, which reports that using individual-level data on domestic violence, they find that evidence that increased property rights for women did increase the incidence of wife beating in India. Thus, this paper finds that increasing property rights, which is representative of a type of asset within economic well-being, resulted in a negative change in relationship well-being, in this case, increased domestic violence. If the program hadn't measured the relationship well-being, they wouldn't have known that a negative outcome was occurring, and they wouldn't be able to manage it. So now moving into the third part of types of multidimensional outcomes, this is changes, measuring both changes in positive and negative outcomes. So as you saw with our last example in relationship well-being, it's important to measure negative impacts in addition to positive impacts. Measuring both positive and negative impacts allows you to gain a more realistic understanding of the actual changes that occur due to a program or social enterprise. As it was tweeted, Jason Saul, Mission Measurement, said, "Only measure results that look good. In the private sector, we call that fraud." Measuring both positive and negative changes is useful to managers. Assessing positive changes can help you further enhance such impacts, while measuring unintended consequences allows you to mitigate such negative impacts. Many leaders in the development field are beginning to recognize the importance of failure and mitigating it early. Howard White of 3IE applauds the recognition of failure by stating in a blog, "The word failure appears 27 times in the IADB's 2013 Development Effectiveness Overview report, compared to just 22 times for the word success. That doesn't mean that the IADB is in any way a failing institution. Quite the opposite." DFID has also begun to recognize failure in a big way. A blog by the Director General for County Programs was followed by an internal short video produced by DFID staff that discussed failures in a water supply improvement project. The video has resulted in the introduction of ideas such as the need to fail fast. And moving into my final slide before turning it over to Julie, I wanted to talk about output versus outcome data. Many examples of the organizations and frameworks that we've listed in blue boxes throughout our presentation that track different types of well-being mainly measure output level indicators. Output level data is more often collected because it tends to be easier to measure. While output level data is useful, it's not sufficient. We need to go further. It does not provide longer term changes in stakeholder lives. Indeed, outcome data provides a more clear understanding of changes to poverty resulting from a program or social enterprise. As discussed in the previous slide, it's important to measure negative outcomes such as changes in conflict over gender roles. So for example, an output would be number of beneficiaries receiving female empowerment services. And then an outcome for that would be a change in gender equality, change in conflict over gender roles, which may cause increases or decreases in domestic violence. Also, as we saw in the capability well-being slides, measuring changes in mental health allowed a more holistic understanding of changes in poverty. We'll go over our own framework, the Base of the Pyramid Impact Assessment Framework, which captures outcome indicators in the next two calls. The next call will be on qualitative methods to do so using the framework, and then the third call will be on quantitative methods to use the framework. Now I'll turn it over to Julie Peachey, the Director of Social Performance Management at Grameen Foundation. She'll share more about how multidimensional measurement adds value for the Grameen Foundation and other organizations.
Thank you, Heather. Hello, everyone. Just to the next slide, I'll just give a brief background on Grameen Foundation, and just want to say that I'm thrilled to be here today as a guest speaker on this webinar. Grameen Foundation is a global nonprofit that helps people lift themselves out of poverty through access to financial and information services. We started out in microfinance, but really have since expanded our business-oriented approach to fight poverty in other domains like agriculture and health. And so we're really now focusing on the intersection of financial and information services delivered via human networks and mobile technology. Moving on to the next slide. I wanted to start by just talking very briefly about what is poverty, and Heather and Yaquta have covered this a little bit already, mostly I think most people, when we talk about poverty, are really thinking about it as a lack of income. But as we know, income is not an end in itself. It's a means to other ends, like many that we've just talked about in terms of capabilities and relationships and economic as well. And poverty can be defined in many ways. There's a couple examples here, and I think we've heard enough already about that. But just also wanted to kind of give a baseline for the group about one of the most common ways to express a household's poverty status is by whether the household expenditure is under the daily amount set by a given poverty line. And there's national as well as internationally recognized poverty lines like the $1.25 a day extreme poverty line that often we are reporting against. And income and expenditures are often used as proxies for each other as we're talking about and reporting on poverty. So moving on to the next slide, just talk briefly about why it's important to measure poverty. Recently I ran across this a blog post by the Mixed Market, which is an information clearinghouse in the microfinance industry. And they noted that while 77% of microfinance institutions rank poverty reduction as a development goal, less than 20% of them can actually report poverty figures of their clients. And I'd heard something like that before, but I really was shocked that so many of them are including poverty reduction in their mission statements, but they're not, even measuring that. So how would they know whether or not they're able to achieve their missions? I believe that objective poverty data actually leads to smarter decision making among managers of social enterprises and holds an organization accountable to its mission. In our work at Grameen Foundation with many microfinance institutions, we initially saw resistance to measuring poverty when we began suggesting and trying to help them do that. And the managers of many microfinance institutions would typically say, oh, well, we know our clients are poor, we don't really need to measure or try to find out, how poor they are. But when they started using our poverty measurement tool, many of them found that that wasn't actually the case, and so they needed to be more deliberate in finding poorer clients. So we really firmly believe that poverty measurement is an important part of a socially oriented organization's M&E program that lets you know, whether you're reaching your target clients, are you meeting their needs, and are we changing their lives? You can go ahead and move on to the next slide. And it's just the importance of poverty measurement in the M&E framework of organizations. So this is a very common M&E framework of inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. And often the focus is on inputs and outputs, and I think probably many of us here are very well aware that there hasn't yet been enough linkage to outcomes and then long-term impact. This framework is very similar to the ongoing process or life cycle that a social enterprise goes through to provide products or services to its poor customers, going from product development all the way through to then seeing benefit to the clients. And I believe there's a great opportunity for poverty data at every one of these steps. Poverty data, I should say, specifically on the clients that the social enterprises are trying to serve. So just briefly talk just a little bit more about benefits of measuring poverty at the household level. For an organization, macro level poverty information, which is what is often only available to organizations, it doesn't pertain to their specific clientele. So you really need to collect that poverty information on your own customers. We talked already about just understanding who you're reaching. Also, once you've collected it, you can then use that poverty data to tailor the products and services specifically to your customers. So, for example, maybe you discover that the poorest in the target group that you're serving tend to cook with wood, so you might decide to do a wood-efficient stove with a smokestack for them. Then once you have multiple years worth of poverty data on your clients, you can look at changes over time as part of a longer-term impact evaluation. And so just trying to link this to WDI's framework that they just presented earlier, what I'm really talking about touches on two parts of theirs. So the emphasis on the client or the customer or the household as one of the stakeholders, and then measuring financial poverty, but in a way that actually draws on non-financial data. So moving on to the next slide, I think we're all familiar with direct measurement. Like we might try to ask a question of someone like, how much do you actually earn? But we know that there are a lot of problems with trying to do that. For one, it's very hard to verify what someone tells you in their self-reporting, and it's often inaccurate. That might be because, as we know, the income of the poor is highly variable, so they often don't even know what they're earning. So Grameen Foundation uses an indirect approach to poverty measurement. We use non-financial indicators to measure financial poverty, and it's really not exactly that. We measure consumption-based poverty, which means the monetary value of resources used up, even if those resources never are bought or sold, as in the rice consumed by a rice-producing household from its own harvest. And I think I mentioned this before, but income-based and expenditure-based measures are often serve as proxies for each other. And that's part of the model that we've developed, and I'm just going to talk briefly about a poverty measurement tool that Grameen Foundation has created over the past almost 10 years. Moving on to the next slide. We have developed the Progress Out of Poverty Index along with an economist named Mark Schreiner. The PPI is a country-specific poverty assessment scorecard. We have them developed in 54 different countries that cover about 90% of the world's poor. It's a simple scorecard that consists of 10 questions, and it can be completed in 5 to 10 minutes. And it was developed really specifically for practitioners on the ground in order to be simple and easy to use and reliable and cost efficient. And the score that you get as you do this on a customer then converts to a likelihood that that household is below a certain poverty line. It can be tied to multiple different poverty lines. Moving to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about those 10 questions that are in each of these PPI surveys. The surveys are developed based on each country's national household income and expenditure survey, and the 10 questions selected to be in the final scorecard are the ones that are statistically shown to be most correlated to poverty, and those questions end up consisting of simple non-financial indicators. Or one financial indicator might be the household expenditure, but others are housing, such as the type of cooking fuel used and the type of floor, the type of floor, or the type of material used for the floor. Education, the education level of the head of household. Household composition, like how many family members there are, how many dependents or children under the age of 16. The ownership of durable goods, like is there a television in the house, is there a refrigerator, is there an iron, and also the employment status. Are they self-employed in agriculture or salaried? Those are the types of questions that end up on the scorecard. And what the PPI measures is useful because it puts many aspects that matter for well-being in a single comparable metric, dollars or rupees or whatever it might be. It's difficult to compare things like the years of education or access to clean water, and so that's all part of this score, which is then converted to a poverty likelihood. And although the PPI is not measuring the other dimensions like capacity and relationships, these other dimensions beyond income do matter because, as we know, poverty does not depend only on things that can have a monetary value put on them. So moving on, I just give a couple examples before we move into Q&A of just the types of things that Grameen Foundation is doing with poverty measurement data. Earlier, I talked about the importance of measuring household level data as opposed to macro data, which is usually this household level data aggregated. What type of data you need depends on the question you're trying to answer. And so that's often what we're thinking about when we are trying to use poverty data. So the e-warehouse is a project that Grameen Foundation is managing in Kenya. It's a multifaceted program that aims to help small shareholder farmers optimize their crop yields and maximize income. It's addressing access to finance, markets, crop information, and post-harvest training. This project integrated the use of poverty measurement from the beginning in order to answer certain questions that we had and confirm hypotheses that the program had set out to prove. So we initially registered about 5,000 farmers in this e-warehouse database, where it was using a mobile registration survey where we collected demographic information, baseline data on how the farmers stored grain in the past, how long they waited to sell their grain, where they sold their crop, etc. As part of that, we also collected PPI data for all of the farmers that were registered. An initial analysis of this data helped confirm several hypotheses, but also sort of revealing some actionable information about the farmers in the program. The first question that we asked was, who is using the service? And data confirmed that the program was indeed attractive to the poorest farmers, and particularly female farmers. Of those that registered, 75% were below the $250 a day poverty line, and 78% were female. And interestingly, as the text on this chart shows, the poorest farmers that registered were widowed females. So moving on to the next one, this whole e-warehouse program was based on the idea that poor farmers have less access to finance and sell their crops early and at low prices. Prior to that baseline survey, though, we had no way of knowing whether that was actually the case. And so so that the price for maize, we proved that the price for maize is lowest at harvest time. However, the majority of smallholders aren't able to hold on to their crops for several months. They aren't able to wait for the prices to increase before selling. So farmers need to purchase their inputs for the planting season. They have to pay school fees. They have to meet everyday cash flow needs. Financing isn't available to them that would allow them to smooth out their income. So they have to they're often forced to sell their grain when the prices are at their lowest. We set out to answer a couple of questions. How long did farmers wait to sell, and is that different across poverty levels? We found that while most farmers sold their crops within 1 month after harvest, there was a lot of variation between the poorest and the least poor. 62.9% of the poorest farmers sold their grain within the first month, compared to 42.6% of the less poor farmers. And this really speaks to the lack of liquidity among poor farmers. Poorer farmers didn't have the luxury of waiting until the sale prices increased before selling. So this was confirming our original hypotheses and validating the design of our program. Just moving on then to the one last slide about this particular project. We also wanted to know if there were differences in who the farmers sold to and selling prices based on poverty levels. We found that 55% of the poorest farmers sold to brokers compared to just 36% of the less poor. And conversely, 36% of the poorest sold to retailers compared to 57% of the less poor. Smallholder farmers, and particularly the poorer ones that have lower volumes, are often forced to sell to brokers due to the low volume and their inability to attract larger buyers. We also found that the poorer farmers sold their maize at significantly lower prices than the less poor farmers. And this is likely a combination of factors, like selling closer to harvest at lower prices, selling through brokers rather than retailers, and it could also be the quality of the grain that they're producing if they're unable to afford quality inputs and fertilizers. Just to end on this example, some very recent outcome results have told us that when these poor farmers wait and sell later, their prices are 35% higher, and the net financial gains to the farmers are about 30%. So far, some early indications of the success of this program. So the last example I'll just talk about really quickly, it actually has to do with a project that I was working on for the past few years in the Philippines, developing savings products for the poor with one of the largest microfinance institutions there. And this goes to sort of the product development, the early aspect of the life cycle, and how poverty data can be used there. As we were piloting and rolling out a new savings product that was designed specifically for a poor market, we found that we weren't getting a lot of traction. Only a small number of accounts were open in the first few months of the pilot, up through April of 2011, if you can see that on the slide. So we lowered that opening balance requirement pretty dramatically, and we immediately saw a big spike in account openings. And that was great. That was what we were hoping for. But what was really interesting, because we had poverty data on all of these customers, we also saw that there was a dramatic increase in the number of poorer customers who were opening accounts. It went from about 27% before we lowered it up to almost 33%. That was a pretty big increase, and demonstrated that our product design and pricing was improving from the perspective of the poor. And to me, as a project manager there on this, and trying to balance all the stakeholders within the organization, this was important to have hard data, so that if the finance department came to us and said, oh, this, the product is not doing as well from a financial standpoint because we're not bringing in as much cash, we actually had hard data to show that there was a real trade-off then in favor of the social goals of the organization. So I will end there. I'm happy to take questions as we move into that.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie, and Yaquta as well. Here on this slide, we all want to thank you for attending, and we're going to move into questions in a moment. But here on this slide, you can find contact information for all the presenters, as well as a link to the webinar series if you need to register for the June and the July webinar, as well as the workshop in October. Registration for the workshop should be open later today, and it will be capped at 20 people. It will be October 22nd to the 24th. Now moving into questions. Julie, if you've added them into the boxes throughout the presentation, Sandy has been aggregating them. So I'll turn it over to Sandy to present the questions.
Thank you, Heather. We have gotten several questions sent in throughout the course of everyone's presentations this morning, so I would like to start posing those to Heather, Julie, and Yaquta. The first question is this: besides the Progress Out of Poverty Index, which tools do you think are the most helpful for measuring multidimensional poverty?
Yeah, this is Heather. I think it totally depends on the questions that the company or the program is trying to answer, because there's tons of different tools out there. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development did a great comparison of a number of different tools for measuring impact, and they compare them side by side. So the more we start seeing some of those things, I think that will be really helpful for the field, so other people can make better choices based on their resources and the questions they have, which tool is best. And then in our presentation, the WEI presentation, we also included names of other frameworks and organizations who track these types of multidimensional impacts. So the slides that will be available afterwards And I recommend checking out those and letting us know if you know of other ones so we can add to this list. We want to make sure everyone's aware of what's out there and exists.
Okay, thank you, Heather. The next question is, can the PPIs be adapted to account for programs that directly affect the measures? For example, this attendee's organization works in improving housing conditions, so their programs would skew the results of an unadapted PPI.
And when I think when the person's talking about adapting the PPIs, like changing the 10 questions, that would end up being a different survey, because it is very important with the way that the PPI is designed that those 10 questions stay together and be asked exactly as they're stated, because they've come directly from the country's household income and expenditure survey, and so needs to mimic what was done in that original survey. Be interesting to explore more about that offline, though.
Yeah, and this is Heather. Another great option, I think, is sometimes you see people using multiple tools, so they'll use the PPI and then maybe another framework, and they'll combine those to become a new survey. So if the PPI stays as the 10 questions to capture those indicators, and then they'll add like another framework for measuring specific other type of outcomes.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point, and that's what we're seeing more and more, is that the PPI is being used as part of a bigger survey or along with other indicators or metrics, and that's really ideal.
Thank you. Next question is this: can we use both direct and indirect measurement to get a more accurate result?
I would say yes, absolutely.
And I would second that. Some work on the work that we're going to talk about on the second webinar, we'll talk about some of that measuring direct and indirect impacts. You just have to be really careful, I think, about not double counting and make sure you really show the causality of what is a direct versus the indirect impact.
Thank you. Next question.
Right, and I'll third what Heather says, oops, sorry, Sandy, I just wanted to say that in the work that we'll present in the next webinar, we'll actually look at direct and indirect on children being the end beneficiary, and how it also differs when you're looking at the child, because they may be getting indirect effects through their parents. But we'll talk about that in the next webinar.
Thank you. The next question, or I should say more of a request, can you give examples of the data collection method and analysis for capability and relationship well-being? For instance, how would you construct the research design and method to capture data for ecosystem outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is something we'll go over in the third webinar, talking about how do you quantify these types of metrics. But at a very high level, what we normally do is we'll find other existing tools that exist to measure something like ecosystem outcomes, and then we'll go ahead and pre-test and pilot that, and then do a survey with those with that target population that you want to measure the change in. And usually we use a comparison group, a third party, and do a measure a change over time, a baseline and an endline survey. So, but all that to say, that kind of research design can be catered and customized based on a company or program's needs and their resources. It all really depends on the questions that the organization is trying to understand the answers to.
Thank you, Heather. Another question, can you define economic risk? This was listed in the slide on economic well-being indicators.
Sure. So by economic risk, what we mean is, and I'll use an example. So if, for example, you have a distributor who's working with a social enterprise. So you have a social enterprise that is, say, setting up modular toilets, and you have a distributor who acts as a franchisee. So that person, that BOP person, is investing a certain amount of money to set up that toilet. So we call that economic risk, where the person is investing money to set up the franchise, and it may or may not reap in profits, or it may not even cover the base investments. So that's what we mean by economic risk for the household, for the BOP household.
And I can just jump in and add that some of the work that Grameen Foundation is doing in agriculture, especially in our Latin America region, we're really looking at that, getting a lot of data from the farmers that we're working with and looking based on their poverty levels and their land size and their productivity, whether or not they actually should be in the business of, of producing coffee. So there's a number of data points that can help us create farm management plans for these farmers to tell them what they really, given their characteristics and what they have to work with, whether that's actually a good business for them to be in or not. And that, I think, is exactly what the economic risk is talking about.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is this: do you have any inputs regarding the costs for any entities performing such impact evaluation in terms of human resources, competencies, time, and obviously money? In other words, have you experienced reluctance within market-based approach entities to implement them?
Yeah, this is Heather. What we like to emphasize is that you can make an evaluation or impact assessment as rigorous or robust as you want it to be, and by having different elements, like if you want to have a comparison group, you want to do multiple data collection points, not just like a baseline and an end line. Do you want to use a third party to collect data? So there's all different types of ways to adjust the costs based on what kinds of design you have. Sure, there's definitely, I think, a lot of people, and especially this is something I think at the BOP Summit that was held at WDI in October, which there's a lot of conversation about how do we have conversations to better get funders and donors, kind of on the investors on the same page to understand like what the cost for collecting such kind of data is, and that help them better understand. Because a lot of time I think the push for some of these metrics does come from those players, and there's not necessarily, it's changing in some cases, but there's not always money set aside to do that. So then I think that's where people or organizations have a little bit harder time doing this. But I think what we're trying to emphasize today is just the value of collecting this type of data for managers, so that they can kind of pick based on what kind of information would help them perform better versus kind of just using metrics that others are putting on them.
Yeah, and at Grameen Foundation, we end up working a lot with organizations to encourage them to really embed some of this data collection into their operations, so they really have it sort of just integrated already into operations, and then there's not much incremental cost, and that really helps with the ongoing performance measurement and management, and also does provide data when they are doing a longer-term impact assessment.
Thank you. Next question.
And I'll just add something. I'll add something else on too. I think there's also a lot of conversations going on in the metrics community, especially being a part of the Aspen network of development entrepreneurs. They have a metrics conference in June, actually next week, June 2nd and 3rd, I believe, or it's 3rd and 4th, sorry. But there's a lot of conversations there about how do you really understand what type of metrics you need to collect based on what you need to perform better, versus let's collect everything under the sun and then not end up using most of the data. And how can we use maybe proxies to help us demonstrate our impact when we can't always get to that outcome level? Maybe we can get to the output level. So there's a lot of conversations about how can this be done in more efficient ways for different companies at different stages with different types of questions. But the big bottom line is just really understanding what your specific question is that you want to answer, so that you are very targeted and don't use tons of resources to answer that question.
Thank you, Heather. We're coming up to probably our last couple of questions within our time frame today. So the next question is this. Talking to all local stakeholders could be difficult when trying to investigate a big, large location. How can we reduce or simplify this outcome For example, which groups would be more important to talk to?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of the companies at WDI that we've worked with usually end up choosing to focus on one main stakeholder at first glance. So for example, we did some work with Vision Spring in Andhra Pradesh, and they decided to focus first on one area, which was Andhra Pradesh versus their other operations. So they limited the geography, and then they also limited the stakeholders. So they focused only on the customers right away. And then later on, they were going to measure changes in the vision entrepreneurs who distribute glasses. So you can take a targeted approach like that. And we're seeing that to be more common now. We're working with Samia of Danone Ecosystem Fund in Mexico City, and they are focusing only on the sellers right now, the VOP sellers. And later on, they'll move to the VOP customers. But it's just a question, and those choices based on where to focus was the company's choices based on which stakeholder they thought that they could have more of an influence in changing the impacts on them.
And what I quickly want to add is, and again, we'll be going through this in webinar 2 and 3, when we use our framework, we initially do what we call a strategic analysis phase, where we do qualitative surveys with lots of different stakeholders to understand what is the magnitude and likelihood of impacts. And then that also helps us narrow which stakeholders we want to focus on in the quantitative phase, because of course there's a lot of resources, time, costs that go into serving large groups of people and large number of stakeholders. So we'll talk about that again in both the upcoming webinars.
Thank you, Yaquta and Heather. This will be the last question that we'll have time for. What incentives do you use, or do you use incentives to get higher levels of participation in your questionnaires or surveys?
Yeah, excuse me, this is Heather. Sorry, I'm a little bit sick, but yes, that's a great question. It totally depends on the company or the program. Being at a university, we have to have an institutional review board to make sure any research we do is ethical and moral, and most of the time that requires having an incentive. So we've done things from ranging, and like we'll pre-test these and pilot these incentives to make sure they're culturally appropriate. But we're doing a study right now in Mexico, and we're using phone cards to top up their phones as a thank you at baseline. And then since we want to find these people at end line, like weeks later, we're doubling the amount of that incentive or the thank you gift. We don't really like to call it incentive because it's not supposed to be coercive, but just a thank you gift that recognizes their time. In India, we've done things like we gave a small clock Vision Spring did for a baseline, and then when we went back for endline, actually people had these clocks in prominent places in their houses and welcomed us in, and they were so excited that we were back and would point to the clock. So at endline, that really helped us get more, maybe did help us get better survey response. And we thanked them with like a small tin for meals at endline with an engraving from Vision Spring. So those are some examples.
Thank you, Heather. This concludes our webinar for today. I want to very much thank all the attendees today, and to especially thank our presenters, Heather, Yaquta, and Julie. We do hope all attendees will register and attend our next 2 free webinars. Again, all of the information regarding how to register for these will be on our website, which will be included in a follow-up email to all attendees today. So this concludes today's webinar, and I'd like to thank everyone very much.